Hello. Tonight's story is about being a woman in the Middle Ages, restrictions, roles, and resistance. If this kind of storytelling helps you relax and fall asleep peacefully, please feel free to like the video and subscribe to my channel. Also, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Now, if you're ready, turn off the lights and create a calm environment for yourself. Accompanied by the gentle sound of a crackling fireplace, we begin this immersive story within the far-off and dimly lit corridors of the core a while. Spanning roughly from the 5th century to the late 15th century, lifestyles unfolded at a gradual and predictable PC. The days, marked by way of the action of the sun across the sky and the tolling of bells from churches and abbeys, handed in quiet repetition. On this long and largely undocumented expanse of European history, the life of a woman was once now not defined via drama or upheaval, but instead through customized continuity and duty. Her identification, extra commonly than not, used to be formed no longer by using individual aspiration, however, via the roles assigned to her via beginning, faith, and neighborhood governance. Her identity could have long gone unrecorded, her voice left unwritten, her legacy certain to land, labor, and lineage. The panorama of medieval Europe was composed now, not of nations as we all know them now, however of territories, principalities, duchies, ecclesiastical domains, and feudal lands, every ruled with the aid of a tricky, overlapping net of loyalties and tasks. Authority was once shared and contested between lords and vassals, bishops and abbots, kings and emperors, councils and courts. For the majority of the population, everyday life unfolded inside a radius of only some miles. The manor, the village, the nearby church, and maybe the regional forest or area composed the whole thing of the individual's known world. Journey was once infrequent, gradual, and traditionally discouraged. Roads, when passable, were traveled often by using retailers, messengers, and clergy. Most people, exceptionally ladies, spent their whole lives in the same parish and even the equal family. Inside this mostly rural and agrarian context, women occupied an area each significant and peripheral, valuable for the reason that they contributed fundamental labor to households, fields, workshops, and religious associations. Peripheral, on account that their work used to be quite often casual, unpaid, and lost sight of in the ledgers and chronicles of the time. Females' roles were defined with the aid of phases of life: maiden, spouse, widow. Each and every role got here with expectations, with duties, and with boundaries. These phases had been strengthened through sermons, legal guidelines, customs, and household preparations. The transitions from one stage to an additional had been marked by using rituals, some formal, others home and private, and in the course of her entry to autonomy, literacy, and property used to be shaped through her social type, via regional customs, and by means of the prevailing interpretations of canon and civil legislation. The legal frameworks that governed ladies' lives weren't universal. In one village, a widow would inherit her husband's workshop. In an additional, she maybe grew to become out of her residence upon his death. In a single town, a girl would act as a service provider in her possess, correct? In another, she could require a male relative's consent to sign a contract. These differences were formed by a range of local statutes, common laws, royal decrees, and ecclesiastical rulings. Canon regulation, derived from the teachings of the Church, emphasized the sanctity of marriage, the indissolubility of the marital bond, and the religious tasks of other halves. Civil legislation, drawing from Roman subculture and tailored through feudal, customized, regulated inheritance, dowries, and property rights. The overlapping jurisdictions of those legal systems created a patchwork of laws, usually contradictory, probably complicated, and most of the time tilted towards interests. Schooling, the place on hand, was once minimal and chiefly religious. For noblewomen, education could comprise reading Latin psalters, finding out courtly manners, and stitching tricky tapestries. For city ladies, it could contain learning household bills and normal studying for prayer books. For rural ladies, education was once largely oral, handed down by means of mothers and neighbors, which include useful competencies about planting seasons, childbirth, textile training, and meals renovation. Formal schooling was once rare, literacy even rarer, and feminine authorship highly scarce. And yet, females did write, In cloisters, some copied texts. In courts, some composed letters. In markets, some recorded transactions. However, most women's advantage was unrecorded, embedded in routines and rituals, in unspoken customs and everyday practices, in lullabies, recipes, and prayers. Marriage used to be not notably an affair of affection, however, one of property, alliance, and fertility. Ladies have been normally betrothed of their early teens, with marriages organized via fathers, uncles, or lords. The church played an important role in defining the foundations of engagement, consent, and consummation. Consent, in thought, was required from each parties, but in follow, they have an impact on of elders and relations could override personal needs. Dowries had been negotiated as part of the marriage association, representing a switch of wealth from the bride's family. To the grooms, the dowry was once meant to support the spouse in her new loved ones, but manage of it normally handed to the husband. Widows, relying on area and sophistication, would regain manipulate of their dowries or lands. However, this was area to legal petition and approval with the aid of local courts or overlords. Daily lifestyles was punctuated by means of work, prayer, and home obligation. Noblewomen oversaw colossal households, managed servants, supervised estates of their husbands' absences, and fulfilled ceremonial features. Urban females participated in exchange, crafts, and commerce, traditionally working alongside husbands in family companies, from brewing and baking to material making and bookkeeping. Peasant ladies labored the land, gathered gasoline, spun wool, tended animals, and raised children. Their labor used to be steady, as a rule seasonal, and rarely recorded. In cities, some ladies became midwives, healers, or moist nurses. Others became beginsley, devout ladies who lived communally, but outside natural convents. Nonetheless, others, whether or not through option or necessity, entered religious lifestyles, becoming a member of convents the place they might in finding education, autonomy, or spiritual solace. The church used to be essentially the most powerful tuition in medieval Europe, and its teachings had profound impact on the roles and perceptions of females. Church doctrine emphasized the Virgin Mary as the best of chastity, humility, and obedience, whilst additionally casting Eve as the originator of sin and temptation. This duality shaped how females were perceived and the way they were expected to behave. Nuns were revered for his or her piety, widows for his or her chastity, and better halves for their obedience. Female saints were celebrated, though more commonly for their martyrdom, virginity, or mind-blowing sufferings. Female sexuality, when uncontrolled or outside the boundaries of marriage, was once feared, condemned, and punished both by excommunication, imprisonment, or public penance. Adultery, fornication, and illegitimacy were sins, and the church saved shut files of confessions, absolutions, and penances. But even in these files, there have been signs of negotiation, of quiet resistance, of individual alternative inside. Restrained occasions. Over time, attitudes and possibilities shifted, although slowly and inconsistently. The 12th century Renaissance, with its renewed curiosity in classical finding out and scholastic theology, ended in the emergence of extra-written works via and about ladies. Courtly literature gave upward thrust to idealized representations of noblewomen, whilst legal treatises commenced to codify the rights and obligations of females underneath various jurisdictions. City charters, guild statutes, and manorial documents began to comprise more references to women's roles as merchants, employees, and litigants. Although nonetheless excluded from formal political vigor and most public offices, some females, observed informal, have an effect on through kinship networks, patronage, and negotiation. On this lengthy and gradual system, females' lives persevered to be formed by the rhythms of seasons, the cycles of childbirth and mortality, and the structures of faith and feudalism. Resistance, the place it came about, was once quiet, continual, and more often than not unnoticed. It used to be located no longer in rebellion or upheaval, however, in daily acts of patience, negotiation, and care. A lady who insisted on managing her own dowry, a peasant spouse who left her husband and lower back to her father's residence, A nun who corresponded with bishops or copied theological texts each was once navigating a constrained world with delicate company. As this narrative unfolds in subsequent sections, we will be able to move deeper into the various aspects of medieval womanhood. We will be able to compare the specifics of marriage and motherhood, the structures of religious existence, the workings of legislation and labor, the particularities of city and rural existence, and the quiet traces of resistance and resilience. Each and every section will linger on the small print, the records, the files, the customs, and the repetitions. In doing so, we hope to offer a sluggish and consistent glimpse into the past, one that calms the intellect, soothes the ideas, and gently invites the listener into a state of restful reflection. Allow us to now slowly transition, within the next section, into the world of marriage and the expectations placed upon ladies as wives, daughters, and bearers of loved ones' continuity. The PC will stay gradual, the tone will stay quiet, the small print will stay many dot. Sleep may comply with, because it by and large does, when historical past is whispered, alternatively then shouted. The tuition of marriage in the core a long time used to be no longer in simple terms a private arrangement between members, however instead a social, authorized, and non-secular assemble that formed the foundations of medieval society. It used to be, chiefly, a software for retaining lineage, securing property, and upholding communal order. For many females, marriage was once no longer a matter of personal choice or romantic love. However, an expected lifestyle stage, arranged through conversations, negotiations, and traditions that in most cases took situation among male loved ones and community authorities. The approach was slow, formulaic, and guided with the aid of centuries of precedent. Marriage, in the medieval world, mostly passed off early. Girls might be betrothed before attaining physical maturity, although consummation used to be commonly delayed except puberty. Among the aristocracy, strategic marriages were arranged to comfortable alliances, transfer titles, or settle disputes. Amongst peasants and townspeople, marriages have been more often than not organized to be certain the continuity of labor on the land or within the family workshop. Consent, in principle, was once required from each events. The Church held that mutual consent used to be an integral element of a valid marriage. In apply, nevertheless, the consent of dad and mom, lords or guardians would be prioritized. Notably, if the bride was once of an age, deemed too younger to make a decision for herself. The mechanics of a wedding arrangement concerned countless steps. Betrothal agreements have been generally drawn up in writing, however customarily had been sealed via verbal promise, witnessed through loved ones, participants or neighbors. A dowry, a fee, or property introduced by way of the bride to the wedding was once ordinarily negotiated with the aid of the families. In return, the groom might offer a dower, which was once meant as economic security for the wife in the event of widowhood. These exchanges were recorded in more than a few methods, depending on local authorized customs. Some manorial courts kept specific dowry lists, others relied on oral testimony and witness statements. In city settings, guilds or civic authorities might oversee and register such arrangements. The wedding ceremony itself would be simple or difficult. A church blessing was desired and inspired via ecclesiastical authorities. However, marriages might even be considered valid if vows have been exchanged privately, without clergy, provided that the mutual consent was once gift. Over time, the Church emphasized the value of public ceremonies and the presence of witnesses to prevent clandestine or coerced unions. Church doors became symbolic venues for such rituals, emphasizing the public nature of the dedication. Rings, although not mandatory, had been more and more used as tokens of constancy. Veils, modest gown, and feasting adopted in wealthier households. In peasant villages, celebrations might incorporate simple ingredients, songs, and benefits from elders. Once married, a girl's identification was once legally and socially subsumed into that of her husband. Her property, if she introduced any, used to be ordinarily managed by him. In authorized files, she would on the whole be mentioned no longer with the aid of her identify, but as wife of, or widow of, a specific man. Her duties have been manifold and chronic. Within the family, the lady oversaw meals, guidance, cloth creation, the care of kids, the renovation of cleanliness, and the regulation of provides. She equipped labor, supervised servants if they would be afforded, and managed seasonal chores. In lots of circumstances, she worked alongside her husband in fields, shops, or craft work. In cities, merchant better halves helped with accounting, stock, and client dealings. The loved ones used to be both a home and a financial unit. In rural areas, it integrated barns, gardens, and sometimes small flocks or herds. In cities, it ordinarily integrated a shopfront or workshop. The lady's function expanded to every corner of this area. She brewed ale, baked bread, spun wool, wove cloth, and made candles. She salted meat, gathered herbs, cared for the sick, and attended to the start and burial of loved ones, individuals. These obligations assorted with the seasons and with family dimension. They had been repetitive and not often recorded in written form. Nonetheless, they had been principal to survival and continuity. Widowhood, although quite often a time of vulnerability, would additionally deliver a measure of legal and economic autonomy. Widows, certainly in urban facilities, would inherit property, precede household firms, or remarry. Some chose to not remarry, seeking independence or spiritual dedication as an alternative. Others have been compelled into new marriages to secure alliances or settle debts. The lives of widows are sorted widely based on vicinity, reputation, and neighborhood custom. Some cities allowed widows to enter contracts and show up in court docket on their possessed behalf. Others required the presence of a male family member or guardian. Records of widows managing estates or litigating in civic courts provide some of the clearest documentation of ladies' legal agency in this interval. Marriage was quite often seen via church authorities because the lesser of two evils leading to fornication, however, spiritually not as good as celibacy. Sermons emphasized obedience, humility, and chastity inside marriage. Manuals for confessors prompt monks to inquire into the sexual behavior of married couples, imposing the expectation that intercourse was exclusively for procreation and will have to restrict pleasure or excess. Women have been anticipated to obey their husbands. However, husbands too had been steered to love their wives and preclude cruelty. Marital violence, while commonly tolerated with the aid of secular courts, was once discouraged via clerical authorities, though enforcement was once inconsistent. In circumstances of marital conflict, females would attraction to ecclesiastical courts. Grounds for annulment included non-consummation, coercion, or consanguinity. Legal petitions from women disclosed the use of these channels, although success was once a long way from guaranteed. In lots of instances, such appeals have been dropped or resolved informally. In infrequent situations, ladies initiated separation due to abuse, desertion, or abandonment. These instances illustrate the complexities of gender, legislation, and social expectation in a world that place individual autonomy used to be restricted with the aid of custom and community opinion. Marriage also structured females as non-secular. Lives married women have been expected to attend Mass, confessed customarily, and lift children within the religion. They participated in parish lifestyles, contributed to alms, and determined feast days. Their home prayers were shaped by means of cycles of the liturgical calendar. Devout observance integrated fasting, penance, and rituals tied to beginning, sickness, and death. Females would possess a Book of Hours or a rosary. Their religious steering got here from parish priests, itinerant preachers, or older ladies in the neighborhood. The intersection of home lifestyles and non-secular guideline fashioned a subtle framework of expectation and consolation. Motherhood, on the way to be explored extra-totally in a later part, was a main operate of marriage. Females have been praised for fertility, chastised for barrenness, and defined by means of their capacity to produce professional heirs. Childbirth used to be harmful, familiar, and surrounded by using rituals. Midwives performed principal roles. Churching, the ceremony of purification after childbirth, was once anticipated. Toddlers were baptized briskly, and moms were anticipated to elevate kids in the Christian faith. The survival of kids was once uncertain, and lots of females bore. A couple of youngsters with only some surviving to adulthood. The emotional toll was enormous, although most commonly left unspoken in surviving texts. In summary, marriage within the medieval world was once a deeply structured and controlled college. It shaped the contours of ladies' lives from girlhood through historic age. It governed their actions, their labor, their repute, and their reputations. The rituals and documents surrounding marriage offer a window into broader societal norms. The expectations have been clear, the deviations had been infrequent, and yet, even inside this inflexible framework, ladies located methods to claim presence, manipulate households, and commonly navigate the structures and approaches that served their interests. In the next part, we can evaluate the intricacies of labor and monetary lifestyles. Due to the fact that how females contributed to household economies, nearby markets, and broader systems of alternate and craft production, the tone will remain gentle. The percent will continue unhurried. The focal point will remain on the uncelebrated and probably invisible work of females who lived ordinary and repetitive days within the slowly turning world of the Middle Ages. Let sleep follow, if it has now not already. The work performed via ladies within the middle while used to be constant, repetitive, and main. It took situation in homes, in fields, in shops, in convents, and in public squares. It used to be not often dramatic, practically by no means, venerated, and infrequently recorded with precision. But it formed the quiet and steady backbone of medieval existence, whilst grand chronicles stated battles, kings, and miracles. The world was once sustained via duties that had been unglamorous, domestic, and ongoing. Females' labor used to be a part of this invisible equipment of continuity, a rhythm of obligations carried out no longer for reputation, however, for function. Most ladies in medieval Europe worked. Their work used to be no longer categorized as employment in the brand new sense, nor did it generally involve formal wages or contracts. Instead, it was embedded within the constitution of the loved ones and elevated naturally from familial duties and social expectations. The concept of separate spheres of work and home was mostly absent. The home was once the workplace, and the office was part of the dwelling. Tasks were shared across generations and between genders. However, many home and subsistence responsibilities fell disproportionately to women. In the nation-state, peasant females engaged in a wide type of agricultural and loved ones tasks. They helped plant plants, tend animals, raise water, collect firewood, put together meals, hold produce, spin wool, weave fabric, and take care of youngsters. These responsibilities had been carried out no longer in isolation, however, as a part of a seasonal and communal cycle. Fields had been ploughed and sown in step with the liturgical calendar. Milking used to be performed at dawn. Bread was once baked in communal ovens or hearths. Butter was once churned with the aid of hand. Wool was once spun on drop spindles. Every day brought familiar repetition. There were no weekends, but feast days offered occasional relaxation. Cloth construction occupied a significant situation in ladies' labor. Even in households with modest assets, women have been expected to spin thread and weave material. Spinning was this kind of ubiquitous venture that the word spinster grew to be associated with unmarried women. Cloth was important now not only for garb, however for sacks, sails, bedding, and alternate. In city facilities, women might be found working in bigger scale cloth creation, taking part within the more than a few levels of carding, spinning, weaving, dyeing, and finishing. Some cities regulated this work by way of guilds. At the same time, in others, it remained casual or home in nature. Guilds were formal associations of craftsmen and tradespeople that regulated requisites, costs, apprenticeships, and the distribution of labor. While many guilds were male-dominated and explicitly excluded females, others allowed women to take part underneath particular stipulations. In textile trades, brewing, baking, and food preparation, women played significant roles. In some cities, widows were accredited to precede the work of their deceased husbands and maintain guild membership. In other instances, ladies operated underneath the title of their husbands or sons. Their names might appear in guild rolls, tax registers, or authorized disputes. Despite the fact that more often than not, without detail, the presence of ladies in fiscal lifestyles expanded beyond guilds. In markets, females offered vegetables, dairy products, eggs, and woven items. In cities, they worked as laundresses, innkeepers, midwives, moneylenders, and healers. Some females managed motels or taverns, others saved stores or stalls. Documents from English and French cities in the later centre a while exhibit females paying taxes, leasing stalls, and appearing in debt documents. These small-scale financial movements had been hardly ever celebrated, however formed an idle a part of the urban financial system. Some trades had been associated practically exclusively with women. These incorporated moist nursing, midwifery, and spinning. Moist nurses had been employed by way of wealthier households to breastfeed toddlers, allowing upper-category women to renew their social tasks. Midwives assisted in childbirth and had been by and large skilled older women identified inside their communities. Their work was once not formally scientific, but headquartered on normal talents and private experience. In some regions, midwives were licensed by means of church authorities. In others, they worked independently. Their practices had been later scrutinized through ecclesiastical courts, chiefly when accusations of witchcraft emerged in later centuries. Ladies' labor, additionally elevated to religious institutions. In convents, nuns were liable for the operation and preservation of their communities. They farmed, wrote, copied texts, cared for the unwell, and prayed consistent with strict schedules. Some convents grew to become economically sufficient. Their documents show the acquisition of livestock, the renting of land, and the employment of laborers. Abbesses wielded enormous authority inside these spaces, overseeing property, managing correspondence, and representing the neighborhood in legal matters. The work was once methodical, repetitive, and deeply structured by the guideline of the order to which the nuns belonged. Within noble households, women oversaw domestic labor performed by means of servants. The lady of the apartment managed meals, shops, arranged marriages of dependents, supervised the bathing and mending of garments, and oversaw schooling for daughters and wards. She perhaps responsible for hospitality, correspondence, and the management of price range for the duration of her husband's absence. Letters written through noblewomen in the 12th and 13th centuries reveal involvement in property administration, authorized disputes, and charitable giving. Despite the fact that noblewomen weren't often concerned in guide labor, their managerial tasks have been big and time-drinking. Servitude was one more normal form of ladies' labor. Female servants worked in each rural and urban households, performing cooking, cleansing, youngster care, and quite a lot of domestic duties. Some were living-in servants, even as others labored part-time or seasonally. Cost assorted in some instances, they received small wages. In others, they have been compensated with meals, lodging, and clothing. Young women had been usually dispatched to other households for service, both as a type of employment and so as to put together for marriage. These arrangements were normally formalized by means of oral agreements or brief contracts. Servants' lives had been regulated via the family hierarchy and often fell to strict discipline. Work was once additionally structured by means of the rhythms of the devout calendar. Sundays had been reserved for leisure and worship, despite the fact that in some forms of labor persevered. Feast days and saints' days provided moments of reprieve. Lent, Advent, and different intervals of fasting altered patterns of food coaching. Harvests required collective effort, generally involving entire households. Females' work intensified throughout these seasons. For the period of instances of famine, struggle, or plague, women's roles multiplied further, as they took on further responsibilities to help their households and communities. Regardless of the centrality of their labor, females rarely owned the way of creation. Land, tools, and stores have been customarily controlled via male relatives. Women who owned property did so, most normally as widows or as members of devout communities. In some areas, ladies would inherit land or dowries, but they were probably required to give up control upon marriage. Legal documents exhibit ladies petitioning courts for property rights, debt resolution, and trade permissions. These petitions provide rare glimpses into the fiscal lives of medieval women. So much of this labor was performed in silence, below the burden of responsibility and expectation. The work of females used to be noticeable as common, unremarkable, and vital. It used to be not celebrated with ceremony, nor preserved in epic, nor embellished with ornamental language. It used to be effectively done, day by day, season after season, within the slow rhythm of subsistence and stability. It was the kind of labor that allowed lifestyles to continue. The subsequent section will explore the religious life of ladies, specializing in the expectations of piety, the experiences of nuns, the participation in parish lifestyles, and the spiritual buildings that shaped female devotion. The kind will remain gentle, the tone subdued, the PC sluggish, and the information, deliberately simple: if sleep has come to you, could it's peaceful? Within the center a while, faith used to be now not purely a collection of beliefs, but the framework within which all existence unfolded. Time itself used to be measured by way of the church, by way of its feast days, its seasons, its fast, and its daily prayers. Bells rang to signal the hours of devotion. Sermons echoed through the nave and into the marketplace. Devout guide was given by means of parables, by means of stained glass, by way of confession, and by way of silence. For women, religion supplied each a structure of submission and, some occasions, a modest direction towards authority or education. It ruled how they inspiration of themselves, how they were seen by way of others, and the way they interacted with the sector around them. From beginning, a woman's lifestyles used to be wrapped in religious rituals. Baptism took place within days of birth, commonly inside hours, because of the fear of little one mortality. The neighborhood priest poured water over the child's head, invoked the Trinity, and welcomed the little one into the Christian community. Godparents, traditionally chosen from among family or neighbors, pledged non-secular guardianship. For women, this marked the first in an extended series of sacramental thresholds, each and every with its prayers, its expectations, and its quiet repetitions. As girls grew, they have been taught normal, devout capabilities by means of oral guide. Most realized the Lord's Prayer, the Hail Mary, and the Apostles' Creed. These had been memorized and repeated regularly in Latin, despite the fact that that means was best partly understood. Prayer was a daily recreation, structured around waking and snoozing, meals and chores, sickness and recovery. The Rosary offered a way of repetitive devotion. For individuals who could read, a guide of ours served as a movable advisor to individual piety. It included psalms, prayers to the Virgin Mary, and calendars of feast days, frequently adorned with small, careful illustrations. Attendance at Mass was anticipated. On Sundays and feast days, women stood or knelt with the rest of the congregation. They listened to readings in Latin, watched the elevation of the host, and bought communion perhaps a few times a year. Confession was motivated, particularly earlier than predominant holidays. Clergymen used handbooks to guide them by means of interrogations of moral sense. Women were requested about obedience to their husbands, the elevating of their kids, their thoughts, their words, and their exclusive acts. Penance was assigned mainly in the form of prayers, fasting, or almsgiving, and absolution granted. Marriage, as mentioned earlier, was once a sacrament. Sexual behavior inside marriage was once regulated by means of the church. Celibacy was praised as the greater excellent, but most women adopted the marital path. Folks that did not both via option or circumstance more commonly grew to become towards religious existence. The convent provided a substitute, though no longer a widely on-hand one. Monastic life for ladies required a dowry, almost always colossal. Handiest daughters of the nobility or wealthier townsfolk might manage to pay for to enter in closed orders. For these ladies, the cloister became each a refuge and a jail, a website online of spiritual devotion and social limitation. Existence in a convent adopted a rule, similar to the guideline of Saint Benedict. Days started early, before sunrise. With the primary of 7 or 8 prayer offerings, these had been referred to as the divine place of work. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. The offerings have been mostly chanted or spoken in Latin. Between them, the nuns engaged in reading, copying texts, tending gardens, caring for the in poor health, and preserving the structures. Silence was saved throughout certain hours. Meals have been easy. Meat was limited or absent. Obedience was emphasized. Hierarchies existed, with the abbess or prioress overseeing the order. Some convents became centers of studying. Women in these communities might achieve literacy, access to books, and opportunities to jot down. A couple of names have come down to us: Hildegard of Bingen, Hartsweither of Gandersheim. Though there are exceptions, most nuns remained anonymous, their labor unrecorded. They copied manuscripts, embroidered vestments, stored money owed, and wrote letters. Some convents managed estates and engaged in trade. They brewed ale, produced cheese, and rented farmland. Their economic routine had been modest, however fundamental for survival. The everyday hobbies of the convent was once no longer dramatic, but deeply structured. The same prayers, the equal meals, the same seasons, 12 months after year. External: the convent laywomen participated in religious life by means of the parish and the residence. They observed the liturgical year, attended processions, visited shrines, and made pilgrimages. Some walked lengthy distances to venerate relics or search healing. Others donated to church buildings or paid for lots in honor of the lifeless. Offerings have been made in coins, candles, or labor. Females might embroider altar cloths, easy the nave, or provide food for feast days. Participation used to be expected and monitored. Public shows of impiety or absences from Mass might lead to social censure. The Church taught that females had been spiritually equal, however, socially subordinate. The Virgin Mary was once praised as the model of obedience and chastity. Eve, in contrast, was once remembered as the source of sin. This duality informed sermons, confession manuals, and religious treatises. Women were to be modest, obedient, silent, and chaste. These virtues have been repeated in sermons, integrated in letters, and taught by means of illustration. Religious art most likely depicted women kneeling, veiled eyes downcast. Saints have been portrayed in struggling, in ecstasy, or in self-denial. Female sanctity was once shown by way of persistence, not success. But women did to find space for spiritual company. Some joined lay religious movements, such as the Beguines ladies, who lived communally without taking formal vows. They cared for the ailing, taught kids, and pursued contemplative prayer. Although now not well known as full monastics, Beguines had freedom of movement and association. Their communities flourished in materials of the low international locations. And the Rhineland, they had been later viewed with suspicion. But for the period of their peak, they provided females with modest autonomy inside a devout framework. Mysticism also grew to be an avenue of expression. Female mystics, as a rule unlettered, skilled. Visions and rota dictated their experiences. These writings, when accepted by confessors or clerics, have been preserved. They all in favor of union with Christ, on struggling, on the injuries of the Passion. The language used to be emotional but cautiously circumscribed. Some mystics had been commemorated locally. Others, corresponding to Julian of Norwich or Mextild of Magdeburg, left lasting impressions. Nonetheless, such figures have been rare, and in most cases seen with skepticism. With the aid of ecclesiastical authorities, religious tasks weren't perpetually fulfilled flawlessly. Documents show females fined for now not attending church, for gossiping in the course of services, or for collaborating in unofficial religious gatherings. Heresy trials, especially in the later core, a long time, many times concerned women accused of spreading false teachings or harboring unorthodox views. These instances had been fairly rare, but recommend tensions between private devotion and institutional management. Nearly all of women, nevertheless, practiced their religion in familiar and repetitive ways, lighting candles, kneeling in prayer, whispering litanies, getting ready feast day foods. At loss of life, faith provided rituals of comfort. Women were anointed, given final rites, and surrounded via prayers. Burial in consecrated ground was anticipated. Funerals incorporated mass, processions, and the studying of psalms. Family members supplied donations for prayers for the lifeless. The doctrine of purgatory led many females to sponsor plenty or go-away bequests in their wills. Death, like birth, was surrounded by way of ritual, by using constitution, and by prayer. In all these methods, faith formed the arena of medieval. Ladies, it outlined their obligations, framed their virtues, and offered restrained paths to authority or attention. Whether in cloisters, in parishes, or in exclusive houses, women's religious lives were slow, deliberate, and tremendously regulated. Their religion was once sustained, not through theological innovation, but by means of careful repetition, ritual, and enduring belief. Within the subsequent section, we will be able to compare the authorized structures that ruled women's lives, together with inheritance legal guidelines, dowries, courts, and authorized disputes. We will be able to move quietly through case files, statutes, and charters. The PC will stay slow. The tips will stay plain. The tempo will remain restful. If sleep has found you, you need not resist it. In the medieval world, the law used to be no longer a single, unified procedure. However, alternatively, a sequence of overlapping jurisdictions, customs, and precedents. It was formed by way of tradition, through oral reminiscence, with the aid of royal edicts, through ecclesiastical decrees, by means of Roman legal conception, and through regional follow. For females, the legislation was once each a boundary and, in rare instances, an instrument. It regulated property, marriage, inheritance, debt, and morality. It delineated what used to be permitted, what used to be forbidden, and what was quietly tolerated. The vast majority of women didn't write laws, nor interpret them. However, they lived within their constraints and on occasion engaged with them by way of petitions, testimony, or quiet negotiation. Within the early medieval period, legislation codes diversified with the aid of neighborhood. The Salic legislation, the Burgundian legislation, the Visigothic code, and others offered differing principles about property, kinship, and compensation. These codes had been preserved in manuscripts, copied via scribes, and on occasion up to date. Females had been normally treated as wards first of fathers, then of husbands, and sooner or later, in widowhood, normally as autonomous authorized actors. In lots of instances, they would now not show up in courtroom and not using a male guardian. But there are files of females bringing proceedings, defending property, negotiating dowries, and managing estates. Fashioned law, the unwritten practices exact to a designated area or group, was specially major in rural areas. These customs have been passed down orally and administered through nearby manorial courts. These courts met periodically, most commonly in the manor corridor or beneath a distinct tree or move, and were presided over through a steward, bailiff, or different neighborhood officer. Jurors or suitors, as a rule guys, helped interpret the custom. Ladies might show up earlier than the court docket to report a criticism, respond to a grievance, or register a transaction. The files of those courts, when preserved, expose a constant rhythm of small claims, fines, land disputes, and inheritance questions. Inheritance laws diversified tremendously across areas. In some areas, women could inherit land or property, notably within the absence of male heirs. In others, inheritance handed strictly through the male line. Primogeniture, the method that placed the eldest son inherited the property, grew to become more fashionable within the later core ages, specifically among the aristocracy. In cities and some rural areas, partible inheritance allowed for the division of property among more than one kids, including daughters. Dowries customarily functioned as a form of pre-inheritance for daughters. These could include land, money, livestock, or goods, and have been intended to furnish security in marriage. Dowries were legally binding and could be the area of dispute. If a woman's husband died, she was probably entitled to the return of her dowry, or to a portion of the estate, known as the dower. Dower rights have been intended to be certain a widow's livelihood, and most of the time included the use, not necessarily the possession, of a component of land, a condo, or an income. In observe, dower rights were not at all times honored. Without legal motion, many widows needed to petition courts, both secular and ecclesiastical, to enforce these rights. Some succeeded. Others were left dependent on family or charity. Women additionally encountered the law in issues of morality. The Church operated its possessed court docket approach, known as ecclesiastical or consistory courts, which addressed issues of marriage, sexual habits, heresy, and church attendance. These courts heard cases involving adultery, fornication, betrothal disputes, non-consummation, and bigamy. Ladies could be each complainants and defendants. Penances have been as public, many times private. These included reciting prayers, making alms, or strolling barefoot in processions. Reputations were shaped by using these appearances, and memory of such circumstances would persist in regional gossip long after formal penance was once completed. In cities, civic courts regulated trade, property, and disputes among townspeople. Urban ladies, above all these involved in trade or craft, might show up in these courts to settle debts, register apprenticeships, or defend their rights to stalls or workshops. In some towns, females were recognized as authorized adults in detailed contexts, specifically as widows or heads of households. Tax records, court rolls, and guild ledgers contained the names of females engaged in small-scale litigation. The language is formal. The complaints are mundane. The disputes revolve around repayments owed, items delivered, or boundaries contested. Crime, when committed by using or against females, used to be also filed to the courts. Cases of theft, assault, or slander involving women show up in and civic documents. The punishments ranged from fines to public shaming, and in extreme cases, imprisonment or mutilation. Punishments were customarily gendered. Ladies accused of gossiping or defaming others might be sentenced to the scold's bredla, steel apparatus positioned over the mouth, or forced to carry a symbolic object in procession. At the same time harsh, these sentences were moderately infrequent and extra, almost always issued as threats then enacted. Marriage law was once an additional large area. As noted previously, the Church required mutual consent for legitimate marriage. Nonetheless, disputes over marriage contracts have been original. Females frequently claimed coercion, or that guarantees had been made and damaged. Men would deny such promises. Witness testimony was once required. Courts examined evidence, including letters, betrothal, gifts, and community recollection. These court cases have been gradual and methodical. Judges weighed testimony towards doctrine. In some cases, marriages had been annulled. In others, reluctant, unions were declared binding. Wills and testaments present additional perception into females' legal interactions. Widows and single ladies might make wills, bequeathing household items, apparel, devout books, and infrequently land or cash. These files, preserved in ecclesiastical archives, mirror ladies' relationships with children, servants, neighbors, and the church. Some included recommendations for funeral rites or donations to devout associations. Others named feminine executors, suggesting trust in the managerial capabilities of females. Though restrained in legal scope, such documents furnished a type of voice and agency close the top of lifestyles. Women also appeared in authorized files as victims. Instances of domestic violence, while underreported, are documented. And ecclesiastical courts every now and then heard complaints from women involving abuse. These circumstances have been complex to prove and often resolved by means of fines or reconciliation. In some regions, ecclesiastical courts informed separation in severe cases. The regulation furnished some theoretical protections, but enforcement used to be inconsistent, and social norms discouraged public publicity of personal issues. It's most important to notice that the law, in all its types, used to be written by guys, interpreted by means of guys, and enforced through guys. Women participated, however, invariably inside frameworks they did not design. Their experiences of law had been formed via gender, through repute, by way of geography, and by private networks. Some females navigated these constructions skillfully, utilizing testimony, patronage, and persistence to claim their claims. Others discovered their voices silenced, their petitions dismissed, or their grievances overlooked. The law was a software, but now not at all times only one. Legal terminology was formal and formulaic. Documents followed strict patterns, phrases corresponding to wit, the said girl, aforementioned, and in perpetuity, appear with frequency. These patterns divulge a want for order, for clarity, for finality. The regulation aimed to keep watch over, to document, and to unravel, although its software was uneven. For ladies, the law used to be a present, oftentimes far off, sometimes instantaneous, continually mediated. In the subsequent part, we can flip our awareness to urban lifestyles and the experiences of women in cities, including their work, their social networks, and their role in the civic and monetary material of medieval municipalities. The variety will stay unchanged, the tone will stay subdued, the narrative will proceed, slowly and without interruption. Sleep, if it is near, may just continue uninterrupted. In the towns and cities of the core a while, lifestyles followed a measured and repetitive rhythm. The whole of the market stalls, the tolling of church bells, the sweeping of slim alleys, and the steady ticking of the service provider's ledger marked the hours. Women in towns participated on this daily rhythm in quiet and usually overlooked methods. Their contributions to city existence had been formed with the aid of space, reputation, season, and customized. Their names routinely show up in tax rolls, court docket documents, and guild registers, but more usually they're glimpsed through family money owed, wills, and the occasional mention in sermons or civic complaints. Urban ladies lived in proximity to their neighbors, nearly the church, and just about commerce. The domestic house and the fiscal space were not separate. The residence normally incorporated a workshop or a storefront. A woman might be responsible for baking, brewing, spinning, or weaving, and she or he would promote the surplus to passers-by. She would weigh herbs, sew seams, or control apprentices, all within the equal narrow constructing. The boundaries between work and dwelling, between family and business, were not firmly drawn. Duties were performed the place house allowed, and, where time permitted, markets had been relevant to city lifestyles. They had been licensed via the crown or the nearby lord, and controlled by way of civic authorities. Market days took place weekly or bi-weekly, and involved the constructing of stalls, the collection of tolls, and the supervision of weights and measures. Women offered items from baskets or carts, or from precise spots along market lanes. The items had been modest cheese, eggs, butter, candles, ribbons, chicken, thread. Earnings have been small in scale, but well-known haggling was once normal. Transactions had been recorded in reminiscence or in chalk. Often disputes arose. Now and again, fines were levied for unlicensed promoting or for short measures. Crafts have been present in cities, though now not consistently formally recognized. In some places, females could become a member of guilds, above all in textiles, brewing, and meals production. In others, their participation used to be casual or limited. To widows, the widow's writer customized enabling a widow to precede her late. Husbands' exchange enabled some ladies to run retail outlets, hire journeymen, and supervise apprentices. The extent of this proper various bid, it was generally restrained to a collection interval. In exact guilds, ladies would no longer vote or maintain place of Joe. Still, the widow at her loom, or at her scales, used to be a familiar figure in lots of urban neighborhoods. Apprenticeships have been a pathway to alternate. Boys had been on the whole bound to masters. However, some women had been as good, certainly in stitching, embroidery, and home provider. Apprenticeship contracts were preserved, list terms, periods, and expectations. The grasp or mistress furnished coaching, food, and many times apparel. The apprentice offered labor and loyalty. These relationships had been ruled by using customized and from time to time reviewed with the aid of guild officers. Training was functional, repetitive, and structured around tasks. Potential had been acquired slowly, via addiction and imitation. The city house was once more often than not narrow, rising in experiences, with keep area on the bottom floor, dwelling quarters above, and storage or workshops in the attic or cellar house used to be shared. Households, servants, and apprentices lived in close quarters. Furniture was once sparse. The hearth served for cooking, warmth, and lightweight. Women managed the space cleaning, organizing, provisioning. Water used to be fetched from public fountains. Waste was once thrown into channels or gathered in barrels. The rhythms of the household had been quiet, but regular. Tasks repeated. Seasons dictated chores. Linen was scrubbed in spring. Fruit was dried in summer season. Meat was salted in winter. Women's networks in towns were casual but significant. Neighbors exchanged goods, shared news, and offered help in childbirth or sickness. God, arranged by way of baptism, created ties between families. Guild other halves would socialize on feast days. Servants formed bonds across households. These relationships had been rarely written down, however, have been remembered in wills, hinted at in disputes, and oftentimes invoked in court. Trust used to be principal. An excellent repute, once established, might ease exchange or at ease credit score. A bad one might harm business or result in isolation. City legislation regulated habits. Town councils issued ordinances on curfews, cleanliness, behavior, and commerce. These had been read aloud in public locations. Women, like men, were disciplined to fines for violating rule selling on holy days, dumping refuse improperly, or traumatic the peace. Ethical behavior used to be additionally policed. Brothels were licensed in some cities but monitored. Women suspected of prostitution have been area to interrogation. Others, falsely accused, needed to protect their names. The road between survival and censure was once thin. Apparel marked status. Urban females of method wore wool clothes, often dyed or lined with fur. Aprons, belts, and head coverings completed the outfit. Poorer females wore undyed cloth, patched garments, and less complicated footwear. Laws, known as sumptuary legal guidelines, attempted to hinder what humans could wear headquartered on classification. These laws have been unevenly enforced. Some women have been fined for carrying silk or for dressing above their station. Others determined approaches to adapt lining more cost-effective cloth, or trimming older attire to imitate trend. Appearances mattered, but conformity was once extra realistic than vain. Women have been additionally involved in hospitality. Some ran hotels, taverns, or hostels. These organizations offered food, ale, and lodging to travelers, pilgrims, and locals. Licenses were required. Rules included opening hours, fine of goods, and conduct of buyers. The woman at the back of the ale cask or the cooking pot used to be a well-recognized city figure. She managed, provides, supervised staff, and negotiated with patrons. Gains have been modest, but steady. The work was hard and exposed females to scrutiny, but it additionally provided a measure of independence. Religious life, structured city rhythms, bells called the faithful to prayer, processions marked feast days, women attended mass, joined confraternities, and supported parish events. Some became recluses and Kreitzdwelling, in small cells connected to churches, committed to prayer and solitude. Others became lay sisters in urban convents, aiding with education, nursing, or administration. Charity used to be anticipated. Almsgiving was once activities. Ladies gave coins, bread, or fabric to the terrible. Some endowed candles for altars. Others organized for lots for his or her deceased family. These quiet acts, small and repeated, shaped the non-secular spine of the town. Ladies also encountered illness, childbirth, and dying extra, almost always in shut quarters. Urban density made plague and ailment original. Midwives assisted in births. Some were licensed, others relied on experience. Mortality was once excessive. Youngsters ordinarily died younger. Women nursed the unwell, prepared the dead, and managed mourning. These routines were somber, critical, and deeply woven into everyday existence. Cemeteries were a part of the urban landscape. Funerals adopted patterns, prayers, processions, choices. Grief was once communal, yet subdued. Schooling for urban ladies used to be restrained but viable. Some discovered letters at house, others attended parish schools or have been taught via nuns. Literacy charges amongst females, assorted reading used to be extra fashioned than writing. Devout texts, certainly psalters or books of hours, had been owned and browsed. Letters had been dictated. Signatures were rare, functional, numerous, ample. Two-way items or calculate costs was once more common than formal schooling. Schooling was valued, however not continuously prioritized. In some, females in medieval towns had been gifted, energetic, and essential. Their work, although modest, sustained households. Their networks maintained neighborhoods. Their presence, although formed the urban expertise. Cities weren't purely male spaces of commerce and governance. They were shared areas, layered with the labor, footsteps, and quiet negotiations of females. Within the subsequent section, we will discover the monastic life, with its rituals, laws, and routines, and examine how devout ladies structured their days in convents and cloisters. The tone will remain sluggish and subdued. The details will remain small and countless. The narrative will continue without crescendo, without tension, and without interruption. Sleep, if it has come, may be welcomed. If no longer, there is still more to come. Within the quiet corners of medieval Europe, in the back of stone partitions, and under the steady rhythm of tolling bells, there existed a further world, a world of ordered days, quiet contemplation, and ceaseless movements. This was the arena of the convent. Right here, ladies selected, or have been chosen, to our living lives apart from the bustle of towns and the burdens of households. These ladies have been nuns, anchoresses, beginners, and priorities. Their lives had been ruled, by way of the rule, formed with the aid of liturgy, and paced through ritual. Their time was once stuffed now not with pleasure or drama, but with the repetition of prayers, the copying of manuscripts, the tending of gardens, and the performance of small but necessary duties. It used to be, particularly, a global of constitution and stillness. Convents, various in dimension and function. Some had been huge institutions with dozens of women, multiple constructions, and large lands. Others had been small and self-adequate, housing most effective a handful of nuns. They were regularly based by using noble buyers or bishops, and positioned underneath the authority of a detailed monastic order, Benedictine, Cistercian, Augustinian, or Poor Clare. Each and every order had its possessed customs, but all shared specified patterns: enclosure, obedience, poverty, and chastity. These had been the pillars of the religious existence, repeated almost always in sermons, vows, and guideline. Women entered convents at more than a few a long time. Some had been youngsters, provided through their families for non-secular or functional factors. Others have been widows, searching for a location of retreat. A few entered as adults, pushed with the aid of piety or circumstance. The system of entry worried a period of trial, referred to as the novitiate. In the course of this time, the lady would study the day-to-day timetable, the chants, the prayers, and the expectations of habits. If she selected to stay, she would take her vows and obtain the addiction. The dependency was once simple, more commonly of undyed wool, with a veil and belt. It signaled her new identity, her separation from the secular world, and her commitment to a lifetime of constancy. The days in the convent had been lengthy, but no longer different. They had been divided by means of the divine office, a series of prayers mentioned at fixed hours. Matins started in the dark hours earlier than daybreak. Lauds followed at dawn. Then came top, terce, sext, none, vespers, and eventually Cotlan. Each place of business integrated psalms, readings, and chants. The cycle was once repeated every day, without exception. Bells rang to sign the occasions. The nuns processed to the chapel, stood in stalls, and recited the words they knew with the aid of heart. Voices were hushed, tones have been subdued, and movements had been minimal. It used to be now not a performance, but a convention, slow, solemn, and sustained. External of prayer, the day was once filled with work. Duties have been assigned in keeping with ability, age, and function. Some nuns labored in the backyard, growing herbs and vegetables. Others kept the dormitories easy, mended apparel, or tended to the ill. A number of copied texts, illuminated manuscripts, or learn aloud for the duration of meals. Meals have been taken in silence, accompanied with the aid of scripture or hagiography. The food was easy bread, porridge, greens. Meat used to be constrained. Fasting was common. The weight reduction plan diverse relatively through vicinity. However, the principle of moderation remained steady. The convent was not only a place of devotion, it was once additionally a center of administration. Documents were stored. Land was once managed. Rents had been accumulated. Provides had been purchased or produced. The prioress or abbess oversaw these concerns, assisted by way of stewards or clerks. Women in these roles had authority, although it was once on the whole cautiously framed. They wrote letters, signed records, and made choices. Their vigor was constrained by means of canon regulation, but their tasks had been actual. In some instances, they interacted with bishops, lords, or civic officers. In others, they dealt handiest with inside issues. Both way, the convent functioned as a small, self-contained world, governed by means of predictability. The spiritual lifetime of nuns was once expressed, no longer handiest in prayer, but within the cultivation of virtues. Humility, endurance, silence, and obedience were emphasized. Individual expression was restrained. Emotions had been to be regulated. Pleasure was once observed in submission. Sorrow used to be met with prayer. Klesh, when it arose, was addressed quietly. Correction used to be given gently. The intention used to be concord, both inside the soul and within the community. Self-discipline was once part of this procedure. Infractions have been noted. Reprimands would contain penance, further, prayer, or transitority. Exclusion from communal hobbies. Forgiveness was once motivated, however so used to be vigilance. Some nuns skilled visions or wrote devotional texts. These ladies, although infrequent, have left a legacy in letters and meditations. Their writings had been generally modest in tone, focusing on the love of Christ, the suffering of Mary, or the beauty of humility. They did not seek repute. Their phrases were supplied in quietness, and frequently remained inside the convent walls. Others composed prayers, compiled saints' lives, or translated spiritual works. Their scholarship used to be not flashy, however cautious. Errors were refrained from. Accuracy was valued. Illumination was once accomplished slowly, with normal pigments and careful hands. Margins have been full of quiet ornament flora, vines, occasional animals. It used to be work of patience, no longer spectacle. Visitors to the convent have been restricted. Family participants could come on feast days. Bishops visited for inspection. Donors now and again arrived with items. These visits were structured and temporary. Contact with the external world used to be controlled. Letters have been read by means of superiors. Presents were examined. Information got here slowly. Time handed without haste. Years unfolded just like the liturgical calendar, season by season. Feast with the aid of feast. Feasts had been the high elements of the convent 12 months. They introduced kind in food, additional candles, targeted chants. The feast of the purification, the Annunciation, and the belief were marked with reverence. Christmas and Easter were celebrated with care. However, without excess. Lent brought austerity, introduction, guidance. These seasons supplied a structure beyond the everyday, enabling a sense of action inside the stillness. But even in social gathering, moderation prevailed. Joy was expressed no longer in noise, but so as younger girls, possibly proficient in the convent. They have been taught reading, embroidery, manners, and prayers. This schooling was once general, but priceless. Some women remained to come to be nuns. Others returned to the world, bringing with them a quiet discipline and a way of routine. The nuns who taught them did so without flourish. Classes had been repeated. Errors had been corrected gently. The system was once no longer hurried. The death of a nun was marked with simplicity. She used to be buried within the convent grounds, customarily in a shared graveyard. Prayers have been said. Lots had been furnished. Her name used to be recorded within the necrology, to be remembered. In future readings, her possessions, few in number, have been redistributed. Her bed and dependency were given to another. Her lifestyles, though most of the time unrecorded, was once folded back into the neighborhood. Her work continued through others. In some, the convent supplied women and substitute to marriage and motherhood. It supplied protection, routine, and religious focal point. It also imposed limits on action, on expression, on personal ambition. Yet inside these limits, many women found, which means they lived lives of quiet rationale, of repetition, and of structure. Their work was small, but continuous. Their influence, though quiet, was actual. In the next section, we will be able to evaluate the legal and judicial realities confronted. With the aid of females within the core ages, the laws that ruled them, the courts they appeared in, and the methods of order they navigated, most of the time with silence and care. The PC will remain slow, the tone will remain calm, the understanding, even as dense, can be gently offered. If sleep is close, let it come without resistance. If stillness is growing, let it deepen. Within the lengthy and normally uneventful days of the medieval period, law used to be no longer perpetually swift, and justice used to be not continually clear. Yet the authorized buildings of the core, a long time, formed via custom, culture, royal decree, and ecclesiastical authority, persevered to have an impact on the day-to-day lives of each men and ladies. For females, in precise, the regulation represented a web of obligations, barriers, and occasional protections. These weren't constantly formalized in codes, but instead practiced within the nearby courts, manorial assemblies, and ecclesiastical hearings, all of which functioned with slow deliberation and a heavy reliance on precedent. Ladies had been viewed legal dependents in many instances. A lady's reputation within the eyes of the regulation used to be intently linked to her marital position. A maiden was once under the authority of her father or guardian. A married girl was below the authorized identification of her husband. A widow, however, would inside targeted limits act independently, possess property, make contracts, and appear in court on her possessed behalf. This structure was widespread, although now not common, and exceptions took place depending on time, location, and class. In manorial courts, which dealt with neighborhood disputes and minor offenses, females appeared mostly. These courts have been convened at typical intervals. In general, a few instances a year, frequently extra, relying on the scale of the manor. The steward or reeve presided, frequently seated behind an undeniable wood desk. Offenses mentioned in these courts ranged from the grazing of animals on long-established land to the failure to maintain hedges or ditches. Ladies possibly summoned for brewing susceptible ale, for failing to appear at church, or for gossiping to loudly records, were kept in manorial rolls, written slowly by using clerks who had been proficient in normal Latin and accustomed to formulaic entries. Alice, spouse of Thomas, did brew ale against the assize. The roll might say fines were modest. Penalties have been ordinarily symbolic. Repeat offenses were famous but hardly ever escalated. The method used to be not dramatic. It used to be predictable, procedural, and repetitive. Attendance at these courts was usually compulsory, though many did not attend until summoned. The rhythm of court docket life reflected the rhythm of rural existence, seasonal, regular, and uneventful. Greater courts equivalent to shire or royal courts handled extra severe crimes. Ladies could be victims, plaintiffs, or from time to time defendants. Expenditures akin to theft, arson, and even murder probably heard, even though the majority of criminal cases concern guys. When women have been accused, the complaints followed formal paths. Juries had been summoned, evidence was once reviewed, oaths have been taken. Almost always, persona witnesses have been called. These weren't witnesses to the occasion, but as a substitute members who would confirm the overall excellent habits of the woman in query. The tone was measured. The outcome weren't always steady. Ecclesiastical courts played a designated function within the legislation of women's lives. These courts, beneath the jurisdiction of bishops and their officers, dealt with matters of morality, marriage, and inheritance. They have been additionally involved in accusations of fornication, adultery, or irregular unions. The court cases have been slow, marked by way of repeated summonses and delays. Women probably called to testify about their relationships, about promises of marriage, or about conduct that conflicted with church expectations. Punishments issued through ecclesiastical courts tended to focal point on penance as an alternative than bodily self-discipline. A woman might be required to speedy, to hope, or to show up in church, sporting special garments. These symbolic acts have been supposed to exhibit repentance and reintegration. There were few dramatic moments. The emphasis was on correction, no longer disagreement. Appeals were possible, however hardly ever pursued. The approach used to be burdensome, and most selected to take delivery of the judgment. The inspiration of compurgation allowed women, as well as guys, to be cleared of accusations through the oaths of neighbors. A distinctive quantity of members, normally 12, would swear to the great personality of the accused. In the event that they did so always, the case could be disregarded. This process liked those with stable reputations and long-standing neighborhood ties. It used to be not a test of actuality, but of social standing. The procedure was once public, however now not theatrical. The phrases spoken have been known up front, and the end result, though unsure, was not often surprising. Inheritance legislation additionally affected females deeply. Are daughters correct to inherit diversified by way of neighborhood? In some areas, daughters inherited equally with sons. In others, sons took precedence. Widows frequently got a dower element of their husband's property in general, 1/3, for the duration of their lifestyles. This dower was once supposed to support the widow, but to not give her full manipulate. Disputes over dowers had been usual. Wills had been read carefully. Witnesses had been known as. The system moved slowly, across months, sometimes years. Cases had been delayed by using health problem, journey, or the absence of clerks. The question of consent in marriage was another legal drawback. Church regulation emphasized that legitimate marriage required the free consent of each parties. Nevertheless, this precept was once complicated to enforce. In follow, many marriages were organized, and the line between persuasion and coercion used to be not perpetually clear. Females would appeal to ecclesiastical courts if pressured into marriage, but the burden of proof used to be high. Memories were required. Neighbors possibly referred to as to describe conversations, gestures, or intentions. Few circumstances succeeded. Most ended in quiet resignation. Abduction and elopement additionally entered authorized records. A lady who fled with a lover might later declare she had been abducted. Households would petition for her return. The courts would investigate, by and large, via examining whether or not the wedding had been consummated, whether promises had been made, and whether or not witnesses had found something untoward. These circumstances had been treated slowly, most likely with contradictory proof. The effect relied on type, connections, and the patience of all worried. In towns, women could even be disciplined to sumptuary rules that ruled apparel, jewelry, and public habits. These laws had been supposed to preserve social order by means of making certain that look matched category. Women who wore immoderate finery or adopted male garb might be fined. These fines were small, and enforcement was inconsistent. Records point out such infractions in passing. Marjorie wore silk upon her sleeves. A clerk could word, followed by means of a modest penalty. The function of women in law enforcement was restrained. They did not serve on juries, nor did they maintain professional legal posts. Nonetheless, they could act as informants, as accusers, or as witnesses. They testified in issues of beginning, demise, and legitimacy. Their skills of nearby gossip and relationships made them priceless in certain types of cases. Midwives, in particular, were more commonly referred to as to furnish evidence about the timing and situations of births, principally in cases of disputed paternity or inheritance. Sanctuary was once a ultimate, not often used recourse. A girl accused of a criminal offense might, in some areas, search refuge in a church or monastery. If she remained within the boundaries of sanctuary, commonly marked with the aid of stones or crosses, she could restrict arrest for a time. Sanctuary was now not everlasting. Negotiations adopted. The girl probably allowed to confess and go away the realm, or to post a trial. The process was long, commonly symbolic, and hardly ever invoked. Still, it existed as a legal probability, a quiet echo of earlier customs. Overall, the regulation dealt with females as secondary, but now not invisible. They regarded in documents, made claims, replied to accusations, and managed estates. Their voices had been filtered by way of scribes, clerks, and officers. The language was formulaic. The tone used to be subdued. Justice moved slowly, formed via social expectation and procedural prolong. Few moments had been dramatic. Most were usual. The authorized life of a medieval girl used to be marked not by using loud trials or bold declarations, but by way of petitions, quiet agreements, and cautiously worded appeals. It was a lifetime of warning and repetition, of understanding when to converse and when to stay silent. It was once neither entirely oppressive nor entirely releasing. It used to be with no trouble a part of the bigger structure where females lived. In the next section, we will evaluate the economic routine of medieval women, the work they performed, the goods they produced, and the small transactions that filled their days with consistent, quiet motive. The tone will remain smooth. The percent will stay slow. The main points, though mundane, will likely be softly illuminated. If drowsiness comes, let it settle gently. If ideas wander, allow them to accomplish that quietly. Within the measured cadence of medieval lifestyles, economic activity offered a consistent framework for everyday existence. For women, work was once a consistent, if more often than not, unrecorded, presence. Their labor spanned loved ones' administration, agricultural tasks, craft production, market participation, and coffee service roles, though not often celebrated in grand chronicles. This work was once most important for family survival and for the protection of the community's material. The scope of ladies' economic contributions varied by way of neighborhood, social repute, and circumstance, but the overall pattern was one among quiet persistence and repetition. In rural settings, the vast majority of ladies engaged in agricultural labor alongside guys. Planting, weeding, harvesting, and processing crops occupied lengthy hours during developing seasons. Ladies gathered wild herbs and berries, prepared foodstuffs for storage, and tended to chook and small livestock. They spun wool and flax into thread, wove fabric, and sewed clothes. These tasks required ability and endurance, ordinarily carried out with the aid of hand, with easy instruments. The rhythm was dictated through the calendar: the plow in spring, haymaking in early summertime, fruit gathering in autumn, and coaching for wintry weather for the period of the year. Household management was once crucial to females' economic function. Managing the larder, maintaining meals, baking bread, brewing ale, and making soap had been all vital tasks. These hobbies required capabilities of timing, size, and upkeep tactics handed down by way of generations. Women monitored, provides, allocated resources, and ensured that day-to-day needs have been met. The kitchen was once almost always a position of work, studying, and social trade, where recipes were shared and advice given in quiet moments. Cloth construction was one of the customary areas of female labor. Spinning wool or flax was executed in the course of the year, customarily, even as sitting near the fire. The distaff and spindle were familiar tools, gradual in operation, however consistent in result. Weaving required a loom, typically operated by using guys or specialized craftsmen, but females all set threads and typically managed weaving workshops. Dyeing fabric was once a separate project, involving vegetation, minerals, and careful timing. The completed cloth was then cut and sewn into clothes, curtains, or family linens. In cities, ladies' physical movements extended rather as previously famous. Some females had been worried in markets and small-scale exchange. They offered dairy merchandise, baked items, textiles, and family items. Ladies might work as midwives, laundresses, or seamstresses. Guild membership was confined. However, widows occasionally inherited their husbands' businesses, managing shops or workshops. This management entailed ordering presents, supervising workers, and handling accounts. Such responsibilities were implemented quietly, without public awareness. However, they had been real and worrying. Craft creation incorporated specialized trades comparable to brewing, baking, weaving, and embroidery. Brewing ale used to be a customary household pastime, but in addition, a commercial one. Ladies brewed ale for sale, peculiarly in rural communities. Brewing required knowledge of fermentation, timing, and hygiene. Ale was once safer to drink than water in many areas, making it a staple beverage. Bakers all set bread for loved ones' consumption and sale, often working early hours. Embroidery embellished church vestments, aristocratic clothing, and loved ones' fixtures. This nice work demanded concentration, dexterity, and endurance. Market participation involved setting costs, weighing goods, and carrying out barter or sale. Women's expertise of quality and price was practical and obtained through expertise. Records point out disputes over quick measures, spoiled goods, or unpaid debts. Decision most commonly took location by way of local officers or neighborhood mediation. These interactions were gradual and cautious. Ladies developed reputations as honest sellers or smart negotiators. Their presence available in the market was once common but unremarkable, a consistent thread in the material of city commerce. Carrier roles had been one more field of feminine labor. Women labored as domestic servants, laundresses, wet nurses, and sometimes as nurses or healers. These positions were annoying and precarious. They required obedience, stamina, and discretion. Cost was in most cases modest, and working variable. Service work might be seasonal or permanent. Employers ranged from rich households to modest city families. Servants lived within their enterprise's house, following strict schedules and restricted freedoms. Midwifery was a specialized carrier in most cases furnished by using females. Midwives assisted in childbirth, told on fertility and little one care, and routinely allotted natural treatments. Their expertise was once founded on subculture and sensible experience. Licensing of midwives diversified via region and interval, with some requiring official approval. Documents show midwives known as witnesses in legal disputes related to birth or legitimacy. Their position was once crucial, however, vulnerable. Based on status and local trust, financial exchanges additionally passed off inside the family. Dowries, inheritance, and items functioned as varieties of wealth switch. Females managed these assets with care, most likely balancing duties to natal households, spouses, and children. Wills, inventories, and account books provide glimpses of these transactions. Items listed include textiles, jewelry, livestock, cash, and religious objects. The documentation is sparse but revealing, displaying women's involvement in economic choices. Work used to be punctuated via seasonal cycles and religious observances. Fasting and feast days interrupted typical routines. Lent brought restrictions on food training. Feast days concerned precise ingredients, cleaning, and usually the practice of items. The percent slowed in winter, when agricultural work diminished. Indoor duties grew to become predominant. These patterns created a predictable float, calming in its regularity. Females' labor was not often solitary. Duties were commonly shared amongst family contributors, neighbors, or guild neighbors. Cooperation eased burdens and bolstered social ties. Workforce hobbies equivalent to spinning bees or market days offered possibilities for exchange, finding out, and help. These communal moments have been modest but meaningful, anchoring ladies in their social networks. In summary, the monetary life of medieval females was once outlined through steady, repetitive tasks, framed by seasons, and shaped by way of neighborhood expectations. Their work sustained families, contributed to nearby economies, and maintained social order. It was neither celebrated nor condemned. however conveniently part of everyday life. Within the ultimate part, we can reflect gently on the ways females resisted, tailored, and located company within these constructions, generally by means of quiet approach, persistent efforts, and refined negotiation. The tone will remain calm, the percent unhurried, and the small print softly regarded. If slip has settled, it's going to deepen. If alertness remains, it may ease. Throughout the consistent unfolding of medieval existence, ladies existed inside many layers of restriction and expectation. But, within these layers, there were areas of delicate resistance, adaptation, and quiet agency. This final section considers these much less visible points of ladies' experiences, focusing not on grand gestures or dramatic routine, but on the gradual, repeated movements by which ladies navigated their worlds. These movements had been commonly small, incremental, and hidden within the daily way. They weren't recorded in chronicles or celebrated in song. However, they formed the feel of lifestyles. Resistance, in this context, not often took the type of open rebellion or public protest. Alternatively, it appeared in more muted forms: a refusal to conform totally, a delayed response, a negotiation over phrases, or a strategic use of silence. Females would select to withhold knowledge, to question authority gently, or to seek allies within households or communities. These acts required persistence and discretion. They were not dramatic interruptions, but slow changes, refined shifts. In relationships, marriage negotiations furnish one example. While many marriages have been arranged and agreements formalized by means of households or church authorities, ladies normally exercised choice via acceptance, lengthen, or mild refusal. A daughter could hesitate before giving consent, or a wife might negotiate for better terms in dowry or household management. Such negotiations had been conducted quietly, inside the family, or by means of intermediaries. They left little hint in professional documents. However, they influenced outcomes. Widows held a specified form of company. Upon the death of a husband, a woman might control property, supervise tenants, and prepare family affairs. This period, even as usually transitority, allowed for a degree of independence, not often to be had to married ladies. Widows would decide on to remarry or remain single. Some acted as consumers of religious institutions or benefactors to kin. Their presence in legal and financial files increased for the duration of widowhood. Although constrained by social expectations, widows on the whole found approaches to claim their interests. Everyday administration was yet another area of quiet agency. Women oversaw meals, training, childcare, apparel creation, and loved ones. Finances. They balanced scarcity and abundance, negotiated with merchants, and managed servants or people. These duties required skillful resolution-making and long-time period planning. The work was repetitive and regularly invisible, but significant. Success or failure in these domains had direct influence on family health. Females additionally determined expression by means of faith, participation in devotional practices, attendance at church offerings, and membership in confraternities provided structured spaces for social engagement and spiritual reflection. Some ladies donated to religious residencies, commissioned prayers, or sought intercession for themselves and their households. These acts have been modest but intentional, growing bonds with institutions of vigor and hope. In some circumstances, females practiced therapy and midwifery with talents passed by means of generations. Use of herbs, easy treatments, and functional care furnished major offerings to their communities. This talents used to be valued, however, in many instances considered with suspicion by means of authorities. Navigating this tension required caution and discretion, further demonstrating ladies' capability to adapt to problematic social landscapes. Education, though restricted, was an additional avenue. Ladies who learned to read or rule inside devout settings could hold correspondence, manage money owed, or engage with spiritual texts. Literacy provided entry to knowledge and a degree of self-expression. Though infrequent, literate women contributed to the protection and transmission of abilities. Social networks were principal. Kinship ties, godparent relationships, friendship, bonds, and nearby associations created webs of aid and impact. Ladies used these networks to share resources, present assistance, and negotiate social challenges. These connections functioned steadily, by means of repeated interactions and mutual obligations. They fashioned the backdrop for many acts of adaptation and resistance. Acts of defiance might be located in small refusals, declining a requirement, ignoring a command, or retaining a private area of proposal. Such refusals not often grew to be formal complaints or legal challenges, but had been colossal in daily lifestyles. They required endurance and subtlety, and as a rule passed neglected with the aid of others. The legal approach, though restrictive, regularly supplied openings. Ladies who petitioned courts, defended property, or organized contracts, engaged with reliable structures on their possess phrases. Success trusted social popularity, resources, and persistence. Many women experienced partial victories, delayed justice, or quiet settlements. These effects were modest, however significant. In sum, the expertise of medieval ladies included many constraints, but also many small types of company. These types had been more commonly indirect, gradual, and embedded in pursuits. They weren't effortlessly captured in records or reviews, but had been gifted within the material of everyday life, via patience, negotiation, and quiet motion. Ladies formed their lives within the buildings round them. As we conclude this sequence, the rhythms of medieval women's lives consistent, repetitive, and modest stay. Their reviews are located, now not in distinguished pursuits however, in the sluggish, unhurried passing of days, the calm persistence of pursuits, the soft unfolding of time, and the smooth echoes of agency furnish a landscape for reflection and rest. May this narrative, with its measured percent and quiet important points, present a gentle passage towards sleep and peace.